Is AMD at $130 a golden opportunity to buy the stock? That's what I'm going to cover in this video. In doing so, I'm going to cover AMD's business model briefly, then I'll go over the financials, and finally I'll do a valuation to show the upside. Let's first go over the business model. AMD has four revenue segments broadly, as you can see on the screen. Number one is data center. We all know it's related to AI. The second one is client, that's related to the PC sector. Third one is gaming, which is self-explanatory. Fourth one is embedded, and this is related to their Xilinx acquisition. They paid $50 billion for Xilinx to acquire this embedded. We'll see how it is doing, whether it's a good acquisition or not. Let's now look into the financials. As you can see on the screen, the market cap at $130 is about $211 billion. The revenue for the past 12 months is about $24 billion. That's the price is at 8, which is not exactly cheap. But the PE ratio is 115. It suggests to me that AMD has a margin problem. Let's look at how they achieved net profit margin in the past few quarters. The trailing 12 month and for the past few years, they have maintained 50% gross margin on an average. And look at the net profit margin for the trailing 12 months. That's only 7.52%. And we have the likes of Nvidia who have like 65-70% gross margin achieving 50% net profit margin. And here AMD having 50% gross margin achieving high single digit net profit margin. So that's a margin problem. That's why the PE ratio is high. Let's look at how each of the businesses are doing. All four segments are having different growth rates and different operating margins. This is the reason why I cannot value AMD as a single entity. I have to divide it into different segments and value them separately, and that's what I'm going to do in this video. And let's look at how each of these segments are doing. The first one, I put a green rectangle, that's the data center. Net revenue is $3.5 billion. That's up 122% year over year. And look at the operating income, that's 30% operating income, which is really good. And if you look into 122% year over year growth, that's very impressive. But Nvidia did 427% growth year over year for the same period. And they made close to $23 billion of revenue for the data center in one quarter. So while this 122% growth is great, when compared to Nvidia, this is lagging significantly. But it's doing good. Now let's look at the client. This is the PC business. The growth is 29% year over year. They made $1.8 billion. And as expected, the operating margin is only 15%. This is PC sector. It's not too hot. They cannot have any pricing power here. Not many are buying PCs anyway. So it's expected. So it's still growing decently and has low operating margin. So that's the client. Gaming, look at the operating income, $12 million. That's about 3% operating margin. So if your operating margin is 3%, your net margin will be 0. So it looks like gaming division is dead. So I'm not going to consider gaming in the valuation. And gaming division is also down 69%. So it's doing really bad. That's why I put a red triangle around it. And another red triangle is reserved for embedded. Somehow AMD thought this is worth $50 billion, Xilinx, and they acquired it. See how it's doing now. The net revenue is down 25%. It's making about $927 million of revenue. But one positive thing is look at the operating income, 35%. Embedded is a very high margin business, but unfortunately it's not growing. Its growth is decelerating significantly. So the Xilinx acquisition is not so good. So let's move on to the valuation. Like I said, I'm not going to consider gaming in the valuation. I'm only going to consider data center, client, and the embedded sectors. In full disclosure, I do own AMD at an average price of under $65, so I already doubled my money. And I also want to clarify that this is not financial advice. I'm not qualified to give financial advice. I'm simply recording my thoughts about AMD's valuation. Now let's move on to the valuation. I'm only going to show one case. Let's first value their data center business. In 2024, they're on track to make about $14 billion in the data center GPU business itself. And estimated growth rate I put as 20% because it's been very tricky how to estimate growth rate for data center GPU, because AMD doubled their revenue year over year and Nvidia increased their revenue by 400%, and we already know that Nvidia is making close to $100 billion of GPU revenue, right, business, and AMD is doing close to 15 billion. So between AMD and Nvidia, it's about $115 billion. And right now AI is really hot. Every company out there is ordering GPUs for their data centers, and they are paying high premium price because there is a dearth, and TSMC also has a capacity, right? So everybody is paying top dollar, which is why Nvidia is able to get close to 45-50% net profit margin, because they are able to hike up their prices. But will this continue? Will this pricing power continue, and will this growth continue? That's the question, because it's already at the peak. But when I looked into certain studies, one study said that by 2030, the data center revenue can get to $10 trillion. I thought whoever did that projection has gone mad. $10 trillion. Currently, we're at $115 billion between AMD and Nvidia. So $10 trillion seems like ridiculous. $1 trillion is another prediction by some people. I think that is still a stretch. A lot of other studies are saying the growth rate can be about 25 to 30% year over year. That also seems like a stretch, but if we assume that AI is the next big thing and it's going to continue its growth in the coming years, there will be a lot of use cases that's going to generate a lot of revenue, then I think 25 to 30% year over year growth rate is reasonable. And I put 20% here for AMD, because if the industry is growing at 25%, the industry leaders like Nvidia will grow faster than that, 30-35%. And the laggards like AMD are going to grow slower than that 25%. That's why I put 20%. And AMD's chip Instinct, the MI series, when asked about it, whether it can compete with the Blackwell, the answer was not clear. So Nvidia's domination will continue unless something drastic changes. So that's why I put 20% growth rate. So I did all this history to explain you that 20% number. So by 2029, I'm estimating that AMD will make $35 billion of data center revenue, from 14 billion to 35 billion. That's still more than double, right? So the net profit margin is 25%. That's what I assumed, because the operating margin currently is 30%. So with 25% net profit margin, the net income will be about $9 billion in 2029. I'm assigning a premium multiple of 35, with which this company data center business will be worth about $305 billion. Number of shares are 1.62 billion. I'm going to keep the same. So the data center business itself is worth $188 by 2029 for AMD. And the client, this is the PC. In the most recent quarter, they grew by 29% year over year. This is a cyclical business. PC demand will be high one time and low one time. They're talking about AI PCs. I don't believe people will buy AI PCs and all that. But 15% growth rate is reasonable on an average for the next 5 years. And operating margin is 15%, so net profit margin would be less than that, 10%. And I'm assigning a multiple of 25, with which the client business, the PC business, will be worth about $19 by 2029. Now look at the embedded. This is the high operating margin business, and they actually did not grow, right? But I'm estimating that it's going to pick up and grow at low single digits, like 5% growth rate, with which they can have $4 billion of revenue by 2029, and net profit margin is 30%, because this operating margin is 35%. And I'm assigning a multiple of 20. I'm assigning a low multiple because the growth rate is pretty much negligible, right? So the embedded business would be worth about $14 by 2029. If I add all three numbers together, client, embedded, and data center together, I get a stock price of $221. Currently they're at $130, right? So that's about 70% gain in 5 years, which is very impressive. It's going to beat the index. The biggest assumption in this is that AMD can grow their revenue significantly in the GPU market in the coming quarters. If Nvidia continues to eat market share further and further into AMD, then this is not going to work. Also, I'm estimating that the GPU market for data center between Nvidia and AMD is going to grow at 25% plus for the years to come. And if that is the case, Nvidia would make close to $350 billion of revenue. And looking at their margins, they can get close to $150 billion of net income. And if I assign a multiple of 40 or 50, then Nvidia stock can easily double from here. So even though AMD's 70% gain in my valuation looks attractive, I'm estimating a scenario where if that scenario plays out, Nvidia can easily double from the current price. So I personally feel AMD is a buy if we think AMD can somehow catch up with Nvidia and eat some of that market share. If they're continuing to lag Nvidia's performance in the GPU market significantly for the next 5 years, then I don't think it's a buy. Maybe since there is hype about the semis, if Nvidia goes up, AMD also goes up in general. And that's the trend. So if you are into that momentum, yeah, $130, a small position, maybe like 20-30 shares would be good. And you can probably get good gains like 50-60% gain. But I feel that at this price, if I'm betting on a semi market, I would rather buy Nvidia at this price. Otherwise, I would just stay on the sidelines. So for my personal journey, I'm not going to add to my position in AMD. I don't think $130 is a good price. For the risk reward that I'm getting, I'm betting big on AI trends, and I'm estimating that they can grow their revenue very quick, maintain the margins, etc. So overall, I want the stock price to at least double in my assumptions, reasonable assumptions case. So if I'm looking at 220, I want AMD to fall below 110. So at least I'll have a 2x there for the kind of risk I'm taking. Otherwise, I don't want to put 70%. I don't want to put my money in AMD for a 70% gain. I'd rather put that in big tech like Google, where I can easily double my money in the next 5 years. So I don't like the risk reward. I'm going to stay away from AMD unless it falls below $110. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.